Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure and delight to introduce Professor Jack Bouchard. Professor Bouchard is an historian of maritime environment, food, and island geographies in the late medieval and early modern Atlantic world. Professor Bouchard's research has appeared in numerous prominent publications, including the William and Mary Quarterly and Esposo. After obtaining his PhD degree from the University of Pittsburgh, and prior to joining the history faculty at Rutgers University, Dr. Bouchard held a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Folger Institute of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. We're meeting today to hear from Professor Bouchard about his much anticipated book, forthcoming from Yale University Press and entitled Terra Nova: Food, Water, and Work in an Early Atlantic World. The book studies the earliest years of European fishing and colonization in the Northwest Atlantic. Before I cede the floor to Dr. Bouchard, I would like to thank our sponsors, the Humanities Institute, the History Department, and the Penn State Libraries. So Dr. Bouchard will speak for about 45 minutes about his research, and afterward, he will field questions from the audience. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bouchard to Penn State University.
Thank you so much. Hopefully this works. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Faisal, for inviting me, for arranging this. Thank you to the Humanities Center for sponsoring this and the History Department. It has been a joy in the past 24 hours getting to meet so many of you. Obviously, I did my degree the other side of the state. Now I live on the other side over in New Jersey, so it's nice to meet in the middle. I have been looking forward to giving this talk for a long time because it is an opportunity for me to enthuse a bit about the potentials for environmental history, and also for me to really use the kinds of sources that are hard for me to use in print. This is very much going to be a discussion of visual archives of the 16th century and how we can reimagine and envision the kind of lives people lived 500 years ago. So as Faisal said, let's see, is this going? Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying, yes. There we are. So I'm an environmental historian who's very broadly interested in food and water and work, pre-modern histories of global marine environments and foodways. But my very specific work is about 15th and 16th century fishing in the Atlantic and how European expansion and colonization is first and foremost about calories, maybe more than gold, God, and glory. And most of those calories come in the form of fish pulled out of the ocean. And the way I get at this is to study the origins of one particular place. What many of us know is the Newfoundland cod fisheries, which until the 1990s were arguably the most important commercial fisheries on the planet. This is the kind of world I have lived in for the past 10 years. Understanding the relationship between coastal fishing ports in Northwest Europe and what 16th century mariners called Terra Nova, this sort of vast watery world on the other side of the Atlantic. And what I study might be summed up in this particular imagery. This is a folio from a hand-drawn atlas from 1542. It is commissioned by the Crown of England, where they hire a man named Jean Rots, who's the cutting-edge Norman cartographer. He's trained in the best schools. He's from Dieppe, and he makes this thing called the Book of Hydrography, the Book of Hydrography. And on this particular image of the Northwest Atlantic, down at the bottom, he represents the world that I study. But what's really funny is this is supposed to be the coast of what is today Eastern Canada and Newfoundland. And in proper, continental fashion, he has labeled the coast with names in multiple languages. There's French, there's Spanish, there's Portuguese. This is a multilingual, multi-ethnic world. But some English author has gone back afterwards and, to make sure that there is no misunderstanding, scrawled across it, the Newfoundland whar men goeth a fishing. The fact that they actually, I should point out that they write where instead of where is an indication whoever did this was either from Northern England or Scotland. I disagree with the newfound land, but the sentiment is the core of what I do. I study the place where men goeth a fishing, and it is through fishing, through fishwork, that they make place and they create an idea of Terra Nova. And a key part of my argument in my book and elsewhere is to say, specifically in the 16th century, there is no conception of Newfoundland as it is today, this big island off the coast of Eastern Canada. And there's no conception of Canada. Canada does not exist in thought or legally until much, much later. But those who actually work there, mariners who do fish work in the Northwest Atlantic, quite consistently use the phrase Terra Nova, new land, to describe where they are going. And I think it is not just a place name. It's originally Portuguese. It's used in kind of official documents, and then mariners steal it from them. But it seems to describe an alternate kind of space. That Terra Nova is not a fixed point on the map. It is a place made by fishwork. Where one goes and fishes any given year becomes part of Terra Nova. It is a kind of seasonal, malleable, maritime geography. I mean, this is sort of a crude approximation of the spaces that I study in the 16th century. This would have been the limits of the mariner's world of Terra Nova. And by and large, they aren't going very far inland from the coast. But from 1505 onward, thousands and then tens of thousands of European mariners are flocking to this watery world to extract cod. This is just sort of a slightly more descriptive map of sort of what we think the fishery looked like by the 1560s. That sort of, if in the center is the Newfound Isle, it's not Newfoundland at first, it's Newfound Island. There's this offshore sandbank, the Grand Bank, which is one of the big fisheries, a big fishery around Cape Breton, and a ton of activity in this little area here known as La Gran Bahia, the Big Bay, which is the epicenter of early cod fishing and whale hunting by Spanish Basques in the 16th century. I will skip over this, but I want to make the point that from what we can tell, Terra Nova is not a small world by 16th century standards. The sources are tricky, but we are pretty sure that by the 1560s, at least 300 European ships every year are sailing to Terra Nova. To put it in perspective, that is about double the legally sanctioned amount of ships sailing from Sevilla to the Caribbean in any given year. Fishing ships are smaller with slightly smaller crews, so the numbers sort of even out. But in terms of what Europeans are doing in the Atlantic, this is one of the places they are devoting the most manpower, the most tonnage, the most capital investment. And I would point out that one of the arguments I think is important in my work is to say, as exciting as that is, it would be wrong to think that it's special. Terra Nova is part of this sort of bigger world of European fishwork and commercial fisheries in the 15th and 16th centuries, that Europeans, always hungry, are heading far and wide to find new sources of marine food. That as early as 1514, a bunch of monks living in northern Brittany launched this public complaint over some mariners who live in a town nearby, who they are complaining are sailing to places, whichever place it may be, such as the coast of Brittany, Terra Nova, Iceland, and elsewhere, and that they're not paying their taxes. But the complaint is that they're just going to too many places in 1514, catching fish, that it's becoming unmanageable. And this should give you a sense of sort of where Terra Nova sits in this Atlantic fishing world, that it is part of sort of the European project to coat the North Atlantic in extractive fisheries. I am particularly interested in a place called the Rio de Oro in what is today Western Sahara Protectorate. And as they are expanding fishwork, they're expanding the potential for exchange. That Terra Nova is likewise connected to these early exchange networks of the 16th century Atlantic basin, be they transatlantic, circumarctic, into the interior of North America, but also to places like West Africa, Brazil, and the Caribbean. So that's the kind of context of what I work on. Terra Nova, its early history, what it means, this Atlantic context. What I want to ask today is, can we visualize what this was like? at both a sort of abstract level and a very tangible daily experience. This is one of the earliest maps we have of the Northwest Atlantic from around 1507 by the German cartographer Johannes Reusch, who claims to have gone here, which is hard to verify. But he's one of the first to actually call it Terra Nova and to map the eastern coast of what is today Terra Nova. But when I say, can we visualize it, I mean a couple of different things I want to talk about. One is it possible to understand how European mariners in the 16th century understood space? I mean, this is sort of is it Newfoundland or is it Terra Nova? Is it the Northwest Atlantic or is it Canada? Did they envision themselves as moving into the kind of geography we have today? But just as important to me, but harder to answer, is this question of what did the experience of fishwork look like? If we could get into a time machine, go back to the year 1542 to this little harbor in northern Newfoundland Island, which I'll talk about in a second, what would we see? We know in broad strokes what Europeans did at Terra Nova in the 16th century, what fishwork looked like. We have sort of descriptions, we have business records, but it is harder to imagine what that looked like in practice on the ground, and therefore, for us to understand the experience and the potential impact, the ecological impact of what they're doing. To give you a sense, this is sort of your stereotypical fishing voyage in the 16th century. It begins in the winter when a bunch of local merchants get together, buy up a boat, and decide to outfit a voyage. They hire a crew, then they sail in the late winter, early spring to the nearest big city, Rouen, Saint-Sébastien, La Rochelle, and they drop a lot of money and raise a lot of loans to try and outfit their ship. They spend about a month shooting across the Atlantic, and there's really nowhere to stop in between European ports and Terra Nova. And from May to August, they are in a harbor in the Northwest Atlantic doing fish work, which is what I want to focus on a bit today. They return at the end of the summer and early fall. Like if this was the 16th century right now, we would be excited that the fishing ships are back. Oh boy, bacalao for everyone. They sort of disperse the profits, everyone goes home, and in the next winter, the process starts again. And I want to take this and see if we can sort of make fish work visible. These are actors, often very impoverished, frequently illiterate. Mariners from coastal Europe are not the kind of people who show up in our sources a great deal, who are difficult for us to envision in the 16th century. And I want to see what we can do. To do this, I have tried to cast a wide net and have tried to use a variety of sources to come at this problem. And I would say in the past couple of years, I have expanded the kind of evidence I use. So not just, sort of images, prints and doodles from the 16th century, and maps and archaeological finds, you will see I have increasingly tried to integrate modern imagery as well. Photographs from the coasts of Newfoundland and Labrador. You'll see actually NASA Landsat photography, I think, is important. But using these different sources, can we kind of triangulate a sense of what happened? So in the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, the bulk of this talk, I want to give you a series of examples of what this looks like. Some from sort of an on-the-ground perspective, some from high up in different ways. These are not exhaustive. These are the ones I have selected. They're probably better ones I could have selected. But they will give you a sense of sort of how I've gone about this. And perhaps for those of you unfamiliar with this, you will get a sense of what it would have been like to go to Terra Nova in the 16th century. So we start with birds and boats. Sometime in the 1540s, an anonymous Norman merchant, someone who had experience sailing around the Atlantic, writes out in his own hand a very long, very boring manuscript, most of which is this sort of dry mathematical treatise on how to calculate horizon lines at sea. But what's interesting is he uses the paper of his book for other purposes, including on the penultimate page at the very bottom, he writes a note to himself. It seems to be in his own hand. It's sort of 2 paragraphs scrawled at the bottom of a page, and it's just called Pour la Terre Neuve, for Terra Nova. And it's a memory aid for his next voyage. And he has two things he says. The first is he writes a remembrance of how to know when you have gotten to Terra Nova as you are sailing in. And what he says is you look up, you envision a world of birds, and you look for specific birds. You look for a bird called fauconnet, probably a reference to terns, sort of these thin falcon-like offshore birds, or a bird called marmillon, which I can't identify, but might be the Atlantic puffin. And he says that when you see them, you're very close, and when they disappear, you're over a sandbank. Congratulations, you're on the Grand Banks, time to start fishing. But he gives us a very visual sense of how people are actually navigating. And I would point out, this is some of the earliest and clearest evidence we have that European mariners use bird sign to navigate in the Atlantic basin. This has been well documented in like Oceania, but there's not a lot of written evidence for this in the pre-modern Atlantic world. And in a sense, he is asking us to imagine ourselves here. This is a detail from a map we'll see again in a second by Giacomo Gastaldi, where he has helpfully drawn a French ship approaching this very stylized Grand Banks and is declaring loudly, you know, vado alla Terra Nova, I go to Terra Nova. That this is sort of the perspective we are being granted in this little note. But then he does something else very interesting. In the second paragraph, he gives an even more personal message. And he writes a reminder of where he left his boats the last time I was in Terra Nova. And he says you go to this specific harbor. He claims it's named after a guy, Jean-Denis Colrangouste. This was a Norman mariner who would have sailed 20 years earlier. People still remember him. And this is probably a reference to Renew's harbor in what is today the Avalon Peninsula of southeastern Newfoundland. But he says, I left my boats there underwater and I sunk them in a river. He says you look for where there's a cul-de-sac and an ensamen, so sort of bends in the river. And he said, mine are the boats which have these particular nails tied on the back to mark them. We don't really have any other evidence for something like this in the 16th century, that mariners were leaving their boats behind and that they were specifically marking them and that they had this very fine-grained understanding of what these harbors looked like. You know, you go through this twist and then underwater, you'll find my boat. The final piece of this puzzle is, so this is the next to last page he writes a note to himself. The very last page of this manuscript, he's clearly using as kind of like a scribble page to like test a pen. And he has a lot of random writings on it. But at some point, the guy got bored and he drew his ship. Yes, someone says, well, you are correct. This is probably the only 16th century image we have by a mariner who went to Terra Nova of the kind of ship they would have taken. This is probably the ship he was going to sail back to pick up his boats in that harbor. And it's clearly what for the time was a very advanced three-masted design, not terribly large, sort of a generic navire now that they would be sailing out. But he has left us one final visual clue. So we have seen how he looks up for birds. We have seen how he looks for his boats in the harbor. We have seen what the ship looks like that he carried with him. Number two, from a totally different perspective at the exact same time, geographers have their own opinions about Terra Nova, and they are very different from our anonymous mariner. Jean d'Alphonse, he's a French Saint-Angeois mariner who in the 1540s, about the same time as that note was written, sails to Terra Nova along with a sort of failed colonial attempt by Jacques Cartier and Sieur de Roberval. Years later, he writes a sort of sailing guide, which he calls Les Voyages Aventureux, the adventurous voyages of Jean d'Alphonse. And he leaves these descriptions of the same place, but his are very sort of top-down and generic. You know, La Terre-Neuve has the best ports and harbor in all the sea, and big rivers and many fisheries. It's covered with trees, pine and other types. He talks about how the indigenous people there live off of fish flesh and the fruit of the trees. He zeroes in on an island he calls Saint-Jean, what is today Prince Edward Island, and says, don't worry, this island is a good land and has good rivers, forests, just like in Spain. And the land is about the same height. So his impressions are practical. Good harbors, good fisheries. Looks like Spain, about the same height. It's things that you can use. Nearly the same time, an English author, Richard Barlow, writes this weird thing called The Brief Sum of Geography, his kind of global geography. And he has an even sort of more laconic take, where he says, I don't know much about Newfoundland. I just know it doesn't have the things we want. There's no riches of gold, spice, or precious stones because it has the wrong air. So from their perspective, a description is not of what it is. They envision it as a place that is lacking things which are valuable and things which are essential. They are in this echoing cartography from the early 16th century, which takes a very different perspective than our anonymous mariner. This is a detail of a map made by a Genoese cartographer in 1511, Visconte Maggiolo. And this is his representation of what is today Eastern Canada. It's a little off the mark. But interestingly, when he goes to label the coast, he can't decide what to call it, so he calls it everything he can think of. It's the land of Corte Real, who's an explorer, of the King of Portugal. It's the land of the fishery. It's the land of Labrador, named after a Portuguese mariner, of the King of Portugal. And also it's the land of the English. Years later, another geographer would make one of my favorite maps. This is from the Island book of Alonso de Santa Cruz, where he has represented the Northwest Atlantic without the island of Newfoundland, the most defining physical feature, that there's a giant hole where there should be Newfoundland Island here. I suspect it's partially because by this time, the Spanish attempts to settle Newfoundland had failed when they realized it wasn't a very good tropical island like Hispaniola, so they get very sort of persnickety and just cut it out of maps altogether. And in my one of my favorite representations, in a sense of how these geographers often saw what they wanted to see rather than what there really was, an Italian map maker copying a Portuguese map in 1504 represented what he thought Terra Nova looked like as a kind of tropical island in the North Atlantic, with these almost Dr. Seuss trees and these golden shores, which, I mean, Newfoundland is lovely, it's not totally wrong, but it wasn't exactly Madeira. But this gives you a sense of how at the same time, different people are seeing different things in the Northwest Atlantic. Number 3, Stephen Parmenius is not impressed. Stephen Parmenius is a weird guy. He is a Hungarian poet who lives in the mid to late 16th century. He writes in Latin. He is dragged along on a voyage to Newfoundland Island in 1583 by the adventurer Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who is convinced the English crown that he can claim the fishery and all of Terra Nova in the name of England and become lord of the fishery. He's not very bright. But he drags along Stephen Parmenius, this sort of grand Latin poet, with the expectation that when the voyage is successful, Parmenius will write this big poem celebrating how great Sir Humphrey Gilbert is. It doesn't work when Gilbert gets everyone killed on the way home and Parmenius drowns somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But right before he leaves, he writes a letter back to England in Latin to Richard Hakluyt, who would go on to sort of write this jingoistic / very interesting set of navigational texts in the late 16th century. But it is the impression of someone with no connection to the fishery, who has never been to Terra Nova before, going for the first time in 1583. And the opening line is, I ought to tell you about the customs, territories, and inhabitants. And yet, what am I to say, my dear Hakluyt, when I see nothing but desolation? So he's not very subtle. Right out of the gate, not a big fan of Terra Nova. I mean, I see more than desolation. I see a beautiful North Atlantic coastal scape here. This is actually taken not far. This is by Cape Spear outside of St. John, so not far from where Parmenius would have made landfall and have sailed by. And I would point out it is odd, and this is clearly coming from someone who has not spent a lot of time, not just at Terra Nova, but in the North Atlantic. Because by and large, the impression of other Europeans when they get to Terra Nova is that it looks not just not desolate, but a lot like home. These are 4 images of different coastlines in the far North Atlantic. One of them is Newfoundland Island. 3 of them are not. I will point out there is a certain homogeneity in this rocky, tempestuous, sleet gray, beautiful coastal world. If you are interested, this is Northern Brittany in the top left, Basque Country in the top right, Iceland in the bottom right, and outside St. John's and Signal Hill in the bottom left. That this was the kind of familiarity that most Europeans would have encountered, but not Stephen Parmenius. He goes on, though, to give us lots of little tidbits of what he saw, what Newfoundland looked like in 1583, that the whole terrain is hilly and forested. The trees are for the most part pine, and he goes on and on. But he sees how hard it is for things to grow. Nature seems even to want to struggle towards producing corn, to produce wheat and barley and other crops. He's entranced by bears that sometimes appear around the shelters and are killed, but they are white. There aren't polar bears in Europe, so he's very freaked out by encountering polar bears. Nor do we know any better whether there is any metal in the mountains, and for the same reason, even though their appearance may indicate underlying minerals, he's confused whether it's useful. But some of his most interesting observations are of what he sees offshore. He leaves us one of the first and most important descriptions of the icebergs of the Northwest Atlantic. To this day, right, is it May and June, Iceberg Alley in northeastern Newfoundland Island is plastered all over the internet because it is so famous. But 16th century European mariners were terrified of icebergs and sea ice. And they found a lot of it when they arrive at Terra Nova. That some of our company have reported that in the month of May, they were stuck for 16 whole days on end in so much ice that some of the icebergs were 60 fathoms thick. And he talks about these mountains of floating ice are so big that they will like turn over slowly and crush anything in their path. That for him, what he sees and what he allows us to envision is Europeans dodging literal like mountains of ice floating towards them out of the north. And he's quite right. We know that these are photos, I think this is taken in January, the one on the left might be taken in March, that especially northern Terra Nova is filled with ice. That's an island, that's an iceberg floating off the coast. And we will see other examples shortly of how much solid water defined the experience of moving on water in northern Terra Nova. He also leaves us one of the earliest and most important descriptions of another important natural feature of the waters of Terra Nova, one which the Canadian scholar Sarah Spike has drawn our attention to, which is the legendary fogs of the Northwest Atlantic. And that he describes that the atmosphere on land is moderately clear, but there is a continuous fog over the sea, a continuous fog. And that on the sea itself around the banks, so the Grand Banks offshore, there is scarcely a day without rain. With apologies to Newfoundlanders in the audience, I will say the one time I have been in St. John's, I was there for 30 days, and there was not a single day it did not rain for at least 10 minutes. So it does somewhat ring true. But you can imagine now the experience of fishing offshore on those Grand Banks, where you're far out of sight of land, is one of fog and rain alternating. Although interestingly, elsewhere he talks about sometimes on the coast it is so sunny that it burns the fish if you leave them out too long. All right. Number 4. Is there a lugar there? This is a line from the original Spanish taken from a series of Inquisition records from September of 1542. And in particular, they are from the testimony of a French Basque shipmaster from the city of Bayonne called Robert Laffont. September of 1542, the Spanish crown starts freaking out because they've gotten word that the French are trying to plant a colony in what is today Quebec. And they are worried that they're going to like outmaneuver the Spanish and threaten the Caribbean. So they try and send a ship. It doesn't work. When that doesn't work, they resolve to do the next best thing, which is in September, when the fishing fleet gets back, and they're coming into the ports of northern Spain, especially Basque Country, and there's one port called Fuenterrabía in what is Spanish Basque Country, they just abduct mariners off the docks and put them to the question. And we have the testimonies recorded where they're asked things like, did you see Jacques Cartier? Did he talk to the indigenous people? But most importantly, they keep asking like, what did you do this summer? Like, how did you get there? Where did you go? It is, for me, the most important source because it is the longest description we have from the mid-16th century by mariners of what they did over the course of a summer voyage and what they saw. My book literally opens with reconstructing this person's voyage in life. But they ask things like, how did you get there? Well, this is Laffont. Obviously, we took the direct course to Terra Nova. Does not explain what that means. He assumes that you would know the direct route to Terra Nova. But he says that when he sails out there, they are accompanied by a ship from Sampo de Leon. That's a small port in northern Brittany. So now we have a Basque sailing with a Breton. And what other French ships does he meet along the way? Well, none en route. But when he gets to Terra Nova, don't worry. Then there's a vessel from Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which is a French Basque port. And there's one from Lormanto, which is north of Calais in Normandy. In other words, he is describing that en route and arriving at Terra Nova, you instantly fall in with ships coming from all different parts of Europe, speaking different languages, frequently swearing allegiance to different kings and other monarchs. And they ask, what is the name of the port where he finds himself? And he says it's called Carouge, the Red Cape. And they ask him if there is a settlement there. The original Spanish is just 3 words, si hay lugar, like is there lugar there, implying like a settlement. And he says no, only a harbor and beach alongside the sea. The Spanish are very disappointed in that answer because, well, they want settlements. They don't care about harbors and beaches. But my interpretation is he was very earnest in that statement. Like, no, there's a harbor and beach along the sea. That's the important part. That's where I worked. That's what I did. And I have tried to use that to unpack what his summer was like in a harbor and beach alongside the sea. Because in this particular case, he has told us what harbor he went to in the summer of 1542, and we know where that harbor is. There is still a harbor called Carouge in northern Newfoundland. It is here where the red circle is. It is on the Atlantic-facing side of Newfoundland Island's Great Northern Peninsula. Lefont mentions earlier in earlier voyages he had always worked here in southern Labrador on La Grande Baia. This summer he goes to Carouge. I will point out on the left, those are 2 giant icebergs floating past it. Right offshore is an island, Ile Rouge, Red Island, which we know was a big seabird colony. So Lefont knows what he's doing. You pick the harbor with a big smorgasbord of food right offshore. But the thing is, we know what this harbor looks like. I was able to get a series of photographs from an archaeologist at Memorial University Newfoundland, Bryn Tapper, with thanks to him, who was part of an expedition here in 2015 to investigate archaeological remains. Later, this harbor is used by Breton and other mariners in the 17th and 18th centuries. And they took photographs, and this is Carouge Harbor. This is standing from the interior looking towards the harbor mouth. This is where Lefont's ship would have passed through in probably May of 1542. That's the island offshore where he would go to catch birds. And this is his harbor and beach beside the sea. This is the open water on which he would and his crew would catch fish. You would have left his big ship here. He and his 17 fellow crewmates would have set up a camp along shore, and every day they would have gone off in little rowboats to catch fish in the open. And this is his beach. This is where they spent their waking and sleeping hours all summer long. This is the stony beach where you would lay out your salt cod to dry in the sun until it became bacalao. And this is used not just in this summer, but for several hundred years straight by European mariners. This stony beach is a site of industrial production and processing for fish for generations of fish workers. I mean, just to give you more images, this is what he would have sailed out onto every morning in his little shallop. Well, he would have called it a chalupa, his little shallop boat, going out, dodging and picking his way along the rocks and things. And it is the pairing of harbor and beach alongside the sea. But we can envision him setting up his little camp here. We know he brought 3 grumettes with him, ship's boys, like teenagers who were apprentices, so they're kind of learning the ropes. They would have helped him set up camp and tended to the fish, while the older men, Lefont is about 50 years old, would have gone out to sea to actually do the work. But this is what he's describing, and for once we can sort of put image to words and understand where he went. To give it a bit more visual emphasis, there is one particular map in the 16th century which I think shows us a pretty accurate artistic depiction of what fishwork would have looked like. This is a fairly famous map. It's made in 1556 by an Italian cartographer named Giacomo Gastaldi, which is surrounded by not just sort of showing the landscape, but showing images of people at work. Some of you may have seen this. It is the most famous representation of Terra Nova in the 16th century. It is not terribly accurate by geographic standards, but it is incredible for the amount of detail. So this was made in Italy, probably in Venice. It was included in volume 3 of this giant compendium of printed works by this man, Giovanni Ramusio, called Navigazioni e Viaggi, which is like this 3-volume collection of everything that had been printed or published in Europe about their voyages of exploration. Like incredible stuff got put in here. But if you ever get your hands on one of the original copies, you can split open volume 3 and it's like a centerfold is this image that shows the islands of Terra Nova, what he's trying to call New France because he's following Cartier, but it shows Europeans doing fish work all around the Northwest Atlantic. Here's our, I am going to Terra Nova ship, approaching this sort of stylized Grand Banks. But as you go along it, you see different depictions, some better than others. At Terra Nova, they almost certainly weren't using nets the way he is implying. That's more of a Southern European coastal water kind of thing. But he's right in showing most of this fish work is being done in these little boats. In English, we call them shallops. It comes from the Spanish chalupa, which comes from the Basque chalupa. They become the kind of de facto fishing boat in most of the Atlantic world after this. He shows in the far north an important distinction, that when you arrived at Terra Nova, you would leave your big ship parked offshore, and you would dispatch into these little shallops with teams of rowers, and that's how you would do your fishing. This is actually quite a good depiction of how the labor would be broken down. And here's a Portuguese ship coming in from the right. One of the interesting things, so this is in far northern Terra Nova, he shows a representation of an old mariner's legend, which is the Island of Demons. As early as 1507, because it appears on that Reusch map I showed you earlier, there's a legend that in far northern Terra Nova, there's an island filled with winged demons that will snatch passing mariners and, I don't know, eat them or something. But he shows them, winged demons, sort of sailing out to try and grab fishing chalupas as they pass offshore. And it seems to have been a kind of sailor's legend that has made its way onto maps. He shows in the far right, importantly, this is a chalupa which has its own mast. We know that they frequently did this. These weren't just always rowboats, but they were big enough with a kind of sailing mast that they could go out for a long distance offshore and come back. But this particular image is probably the most accurate depiction he includes, because it shows, this is in the bottom of the map, 2 men in a shallop using hand lines to pull a codfish out of the water. We know from literary and archaeological evidence, the overwhelming majority of fishing at Terra Nova is using a very long rope with a big metal hook at the end, and you are catching codfish one at a time. You're baiting it with bits of bird and fish and whatever else you have, but every codfish is caught the old-fashioned way. And he is showing that here very accurately. We know that he's depicting a very specific place. You can sort of line up what he represents on his map and showing that he's showing what is today the Cabot Straits between Newfoundland Island and Cape Breton Island. He even includes a depiction of Ile de Sable, Sable Island, this sandbank off the shore of Nova Scotia, which in the 1540s, the Portuguese dump a bunch of cows on the island and leave them there so that occasionally if they get hungry, they can go and catch some cows. Today, it has a famous wild horse population, which I think I just saw a Twitter article is in danger of being exterminated. But we know that he is depicting one of the major fisheries. Cape Breton Island is one of the epicenters of mid-16th century fishing. And Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, still sovereign French territory. The island of Saint-Pierre and sort of this little bit down here was one of the earliest parts of southern Newfoundland Island to have a fishery on it. I will highlight one other thing. Not only does he show a very accurate depiction of fishing in this part of the map, notice how they are surrounded by birds. Bird, 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 bird. A lot of my recent thinking, inspired by images like this, has been about how important birds were to fish in the 16th century. Almost every major fishing harbor was near a seabird colony because, according to the French, they are good eating. Pickled, the English prefer to smash bird like gannet eggs and eat them fried and things like that. But we know that seabirds have their sort of breeding season in the spring and summer right when fish worker ships arrived, that there's this kind of pulse of available seabird food right when fish workers arriving in places like Cape Breton Island. And somehow Gastaldi understands that and has depicted it here. Let me also add, we have one other good depiction of the act of fish work on another map. This is a detail by a French map from 1546 by Pierre Descalier, which is the only depiction of Basque whalers in action. The Basque whaling industry is its own thing, but very clearly showing a team of whalers in a chalupa. 3 of them are rowing. 1 of them is holding sort of a backup harpoon, and at the front is your harpooner spearing a whale. And we know they are Basque because they are wearing sort of distinctive Basque garb, these red hats and red sea clothes that set them apart. And in fact, the ship they are using, we have recovered example of this from Red Bay, Labrador. This is an original Basque chalupa that we pulled out of the water. And these early depictions in artwork seem to be quite accurate for what would go on to be the most important ship in Atlantic fishing. To zoom out completely, I've just given you a very zoomed in picture of how Terra Nova is depicted. One of the sources I have tried to mix this with, and have increasingly come to rely on in the past couple of years, are NASA Landsat photographs. So in the 1970s, the NASA sends a bunch of satellites into orbit to photograph the Earth. Many of these images are now publicly available for free through NASA, and they are incredible. They are obviously from the 20th and 21st century. They are not depictions of Terra Nova as it was then. But to me, they are invaluable for one specific reason. They allow us to see Newfoundland, Labrador, Cape Breton, to see Terra Nova in color and changing over the course of a year in a way these other images can't. They show us the color of the water and the color of the land, the vividness of this world in a way our written evidence can't. They show us what a sunrise over La Grande Baia would look like. When Robert Laffont wakes up in the morning of July 1542, this is the sight that will greet him. La Grande Baia on the right, Great Northern Peninsula on the left, Carouge Harbor is right about here. That this is the vividness of the natural world waiting to meet them. That we can see the phytoplankton bloom. That is the reason cod exist off the south coast of Newfoundland. That the sea, this upswelling of life that forms the bottom of the food chain that will lead to cod, that will lead to human predation. But this to me is the most important image we have of the Northwest Atlantic. This is a photo taken in April of 2011 by a NASA satellite, because it shows us the essential environmental and climatological feature of the Northwest Atlantic, which is how seasons change. This is a subarctic world. There is a strong seasonal swing between a short, intense warm season and a longer cold season. And here in April, you can see spring making its way north. That it has already turned Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island brown and green, and it is eking its way into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But even in April, look at how much of the rest of Terra Nova is still covered in ice and snow. This is March 31st. This is a date that fishing ships would have started to arrive from Europe, probably. And Terra Nova is still white on black. It is ice and snow on a deep, cold ocean. And if you went further into the interior, you get a sense of the weather, of the freezing temperatures. This is why people are so terrified of icebergs, why they are terrified of getting there too early and desperate to make the most of these short, intense summer months. And this is why you never go to Terra Nova in the winter. What is this? January 2020 along La Grande Baia. And you can see how it has been closed off to human settlement and human extraction. Neither in European mariners nor indigenous communities would overwinter on the coasts under conditions like this. The last example I have for you quickly, this is something I made a while ago. As those last set of images suggest, what defines the Northwest Atlantic is that it moves. It is not static. It changes over the course of the year. That is very hard for us to relate in static, two-dimensional images, like maps. This is a crude slideshow I put together years ago that is a 12-month tour of the 16th century Terra Nova fisheries, showing you how people would move, how sea ice would move, and how Terra Nova gets created through fishwork every year. By March, indigenous peoples have migrated to the coast. By April, the first European fishing ships have arrived on the Grand Banks. By May, they're at Cape Breton. The sea ice is receding. By June, they are in La Gran Bahia. We know that's about when they arrive. And they are spreading inward, and indigenous peoples have now sort of been swamped by this European world of Terra Nova. Come early August, they begin to leave. Terra Nova starts to shrink as the fishing ships head out. And at the same time, indigenous communities begin to migrate away from the coasts and back towards the interior. Only a handful of Basque whalers hold out until October and November in La Gran Bahia. And at the same time, the sea ice comes back until in December, everyone's gone. So, in the last couple minutes, I want to float a couple of conclusions from what we can glean from these different examples. One is I'm trying to make the point is you can visualize more than you would think. Despite the paucity of sources and the difficulty of the evidence from the 16th century fisheries, I'm trying to give you a sense if you bring a lot of stuff together, they were trying to tell us in words and images what their world looked like. And we can imagine what it looked like if we can sort of take modern sources as well and cross-reference them. And when we do that, it allows us to recover perspectives often from the bottom up, what it actually looked like to a fish worker on the ground on a beach in 1542. What it looked like if you were a Hungarian poet stepping off the boat onto Cape Spear and you were like, oh my God, I don't want to be here. But we may ask if that's the case, what is to be gained? What is the usefulness of this kind of inquiry? Because this isn't art history, it's not archaeology, it's kind of history, but I think it's useful. To me, it is important to my wider project of unflattening the 16th century Northwest Atlantic. I think historians have a tendency to take what is a vibrant, dynamic, beautiful world and simplify and flatten it. I am trying to fight back against that. We treat fishwork as timeless and static instead of something that changes and is always being improvised. We use modern place names and personal names. John Cabot visited Newfoundland instead of Juan Caboto found Terra Nova, in a way that collapses time and space. We approach Terra Nova's history along ethnic, national, and linguistic lines. Most scholars work on the English at Terra Nova, the French at Terra Nova, the Spanish. We tend to isolate Terra Nova from the rest of the Atlantic. We assume it always had to be a fishery. Maybe it could have been a tropical island. They certainly thought that in 1504. And we tend to only use written sources to interpret its past. If we think more about what it looked like, we can maybe better understand what its impact was, what the ecological and human impact of these fisheries were. What did Robert Laffont do to that beach and harbor beside the sea when he spent 3 months there in 1542? But the last thing I'd say has nothing to do with this, and why I think this is important, why I'm so happy to be here today. It's because I think images matter and we're bad at it. Look, many of us in this room are professional academics in the historical profession. I think we can all agree that we have been trained and sort of implicitly instructed that the only legitimate form of scholarly communication is the written word. To put that in perspective, my book will count towards my tenure file. This slideshow will not. But the problem is the written word is very bad at conveying a lot of information, especially information about envisioning, about visual evidence. Large chunks of what I just showed you is stuff that didn't make the cut to my manuscript. I have a fixed number of 20 images I had to use, and you just saw dozens of them. I could never show you that sort of moving slideshow of 12 months in Terra Nova because you can't translate that into a page. This is why I was so excited to come and give this talk, because I think communication beyond the written word is important. I think we should focus more on using a combination of imagery and the spoken word to communicate. If we may channel our Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the massage or message. And why I was so excited to frankly share this stuff with you, because I find it exciting, funny, cool. And I don't often get to write about it and print it because it doesn't quite work that way. So I hope you have enjoyed my attempt to show you that we can understand the complexity, variation, and dynamism, and maybe see Terra Nova a little better. Thanks.
Paige will hand the microphone to go into the person. Yep.
okay. So thank you very much. And this expands on the dinner that we had last night. So I have many questions, but one of the two primary ones have to do with sources, the resources. So one, if they're making salted cod, where are they getting the salt? And then two, the chalupa.
Yep.
Were they making them in Newfoundland or were they bringing them across the ocean?
Okay, so I can answer about this. So where does the salt come from? Someone had asked me this earlier in the day, and it's an interesting question. So the salt has to be brought from Europe. And in fact, like the logistics of that is important. There's two main sources. One is a place called Setúbal, which is a salt mine south of Lisbon in Portugal. The problem is you can only get salt from there if you're on the right terms with the Portuguese government. The bigger source is what's called bay salt, which is marsh salt from the Bay of Biscay in what is today France. I've been there, and like you can still go, there are these big brackish marshes along the coast that you can build salt pans in. You also raise cows there. And you get this, it's a very rough gray ocean salt. This is why a lot of the mariners themselves come from around the Bay of Biscay. They have access to it. There's been a long argument in the historiography that one of the reasons the English sort of have trouble at Newfoundland, because they permanently fish on the island of Newfoundland, why it takes them a while is they don't have access to that because they're often at war with France, so they don't have a lot of salt. They tend to develop sort of less salt intensive techniques. The other thing is like cities further away, especially in Normandy, it's every year in January, they will send like a special salt fleet to go early, pick up salt, bring it back to the city, and then when the ships are outfitting in Rouen, they're ready. And like it shows up in like the city council records. Frequently they get bushwhacked by pirates and it's a whole deal. But like it's part of the reason Normandy is such a fishing powerhouse at Terra Nova is they organize that. So that chalupas. One thing I will highlight, the archaeologist who's at Université de Montréal, Brad Lowen, has done incredible work on the history of chalupas recently and pointed out there's very good evidence by as early as 1600, so within a few decades of this technology being introduced to the Northwest Atlantic, that indigenous peoples across what is today Northeastern North America adopt the chalupa. Innu, Mi'kmaq, Inuit, and as far south as into the Gulf of Maine. Sort of English, I think it's in 1604, English voyagers who get to like southern Gulf of Maine around Kittery encounter locals using chalupas. They are mostly probably brought with them. They often show up in like sort of like charter parties, like the manifests. They're probably disassembled. So you carry them as sort of like disassembled ship planks of board, and you bring nails with you. And then when you get to Terra Nova, you reassemble them. This is also probably one of the reasons why that guy, that anonymous mariner, like kept his over winter and he like sunk them where no one could find them to save him the trouble of having to cart them back and forth. But it's one of those things they were probably bringing with them. But again, you know, in terms of ecological impact, you're hauling salt, you're hauling ships across the ocean, and you're introducing them to the waters of Terra Nova. Oh yeah.
So you know, we were discussing fishing stages earlier, and both boats and sometimes salt would be covered and left behind, or in your evidence, submerged. And I guess I have a question. I'm wondering about the manuscript from the 1540s. The manuscript evidence. About the relationship between that kind of claim to a property and the capacity to enforce that under law. And I mean, there's some evidence that although these kinds of objects left behind, like ships or boats and salt, weren't protected by common law, or you know, were difficult to establish as property under common law in this part of the world. By the late 1620s, in the English equity courts, in the prerogative courts, it was possible to to make a claim and to prosecute
Yeah.
like other crews that stole these objects or made use of these objects without the license of those who had left them behind. It was possible to prosecute those individuals successfully in these again these equity courts. I'm wondering if you have other instances just addressing your theme of kind of variation and change of a similar kind of phenomenon where again this identification with these objects in terms of property could actually become enforceable or could be established as a property for for social purposes under the law.
That's a good question. I don't know of any evidence from the 16th century where that's the case. So a couple of things I'd say. One, the fact that he says, I left it there and I marked it using this particular sort of like bent nail makes me think it's a customary thing. That sort of like the custom of the country in Terra Nova is if you're gonna leave it behind, everyone has their own kind of mark. And you just hope that the other people who know, I mean, I guess the implication is if everyone keeps going back to the same harbor, everyone sort of knows each other's stuff. Two, with fishing ships, the kind of legal arrangements get really tricky really fast because there's so many legally involved parties in a different. So typically in the 16th century, one person doesn't own a ship. It's usually owned by multiple parties. The French notarial records in particular show often they'll say like by the way, if you don't know, legally in the 16th century, the bureaucratic term for a ship owner is bourgeois. I am a bourgeois of a ship. Which is weird because it also means you're the member of a civic body. So there's this double bourgeois. But like you would often say like I'm bourgeois pour un demi-quart for half a quarter of a ship, or like for an eighth of a ship, or for half a ship, which implies that there's like 2, 3, 4, 8 different people owning a given ship. And then there's also like you'd often hire a separate outfitter. Someone might charter it. There might be an insurer. So actually the question of sort of like who owns a specific pair of boats could get really tricky really quick. This guy, the way it's written implies he's probably a merchant who owns the ship. And I wonder if he put up the money to buy the boat, so he considers them his property. But I think the last thing I'd say is my guess is it's a gamble. That sort of, if someone wants to take your boats, there's no way to stop them. And these are very litigious people. There's a lot of lawsuits that will happen back in Europe in the 16th century, in France and Spain. But I don't know of any involving property at Terra Nova, like a fishing stage or a boat or something like that, unless piracy is involved, in which case, sort of once it tries to get sold as a prize, then people will challenge it. Now the question is why? I don't know. My guess is it's customary. And the implication is, you're sort of taking the risk if you leave something behind. But I think you're right. I hadn't thought about this is so common by the early 17th century. They're probably leaving a lot more stuff behind than we think. Now I need to go back and see if there's any court cases about this, but none come to mind, which is, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That makes it. I suspect that the French just are either incapable or disinterested in doing that, and I think the Spanish are much more concerned with the Caribbean and New Spain in terms of setting up these property regimes. That's a great question. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to add to that that some of the contracts that you're talking about with the development of limited liability in the late 13th and early 14th century, that's where, at least from the medieval perspective, you get some of those layers of ownership that you've got people who are owning the boats, but then you've also got the cargo, and you've got and the contracts actually seem very similar.
Yes.
What you were just talking about similar to what I see in the Middle Ages?
They can be quite long and detailed, and the more parties get involved, exactly that of like they're very specific of who's responsible for what. I'm curious who would be responsible if something gets stolen, and every now and then there will be sort of cross-national suing where like an Englishman will be brought to court by a Breton for something they did. It usually doesn't work very well, but there's like a couple of instances, usually having to do with prizes. But that's a good question, yeah.
I have a question about this might be a bit outside of what you're doing, but the role of gender in this, and where you see perhaps women coming along in these ships, because there was parts of one of the maps that you showed where there was like these like housing structures or kind of like thatch structures. I couldn't tell if there was like long hair on some of the people in there, but yeah, so I was wondering just how often, or if the records show women joining these voyages, and if they are, which I assume that they are, just don't know how many, the type of work that they're doing, because it just seems like a very masculine space.
It is.
Okay, so yeah, like in the center area or on like the right hand side.
These are supposed to be Mi'kmaqi people here.
Oh, okay.
Great question.
Okay.
So it doesn't come up in this particular work, but I am happy you asked it because it is taken on a larger part of my work than I thought, the gendered aspect. So the kind of background is, I assume no one here does fisheries history, sort of gender in fish work and gender in maritime history, it's deeply fucked up. Just in terms of, I mean, in English, the default word for someone who goes fishing is fisherman. It is an inherently gendered form of labor that has worked its way into our language. There's only recently been a lot of work on the gendered aspects of fishing across time, and in particular that in the Western world, it tends to be so aggressively gendered. From what I and everyone else can tell, no European women go to Terra Nova in the 16th or 17th century. These crews genuinely seem to be entirely male. As Peter Pope has argued, who's an archaeologist, that we should read a fishing stage, like a fishing camp, as an exclusively male gendered space. I would point out, this is one of the many aspects of the Terra Nova fishery, which must have been very disorienting and weird to a European mariner, to suddenly be cut off from a kind of multi-gendered and familial world and spend like 5 months just with guys. Interestingly, there are almost, just the evidence is terrible, as we talked about this morning, but there are no references to interactions between European fish workers and indigenous women in the 16th century. I will point out an aspect of contact between the two groups is that because the European arrival, they're so diffuse, they're spread out over the water, and because indigenous peoples both know the terrain better, are themselves expert mariners, if they want to avoid contact with the Europeans, it's super easy. So I suspect they are able to keep certain parts of the population away from. The catch is, my big argument is that fact has blinded us to the fact that women are super involved with the fishery at every other level. Women are ship owners and ship outfitters. 1590, there's a Basque woman who has a ship named after herself, and she sends her son to Terra Nova. They are loaning money left and right. They are often the creditor, or they will collect things in their husband's name. They're the ones like selling food and sea clothes to people before they head away, so they are provisioning them. They are involved with the trade when it gets back. So there's a woman from Paris who like makes contracts with the city of Rouen because she's sort of buying up bacalao as it comes back and trading it up and down the Seine River. When the ship actually gets back to harbor, it is often women who unload the cargo from the docks, take it to market, and then once you are in the market, it is almost exclusively women. We have both visual representations and litigation making clear, especially in France, Léal, in the Fishmarkt, in the Low Countries, it is overwhelmingly a women's space. So my argument is like, we have so focused on the ship itself and the fish work as being an exclusively male space. We have written women out of the bigger system of fish work and network labor, but they are there. But this is, I'm glad you asked this, because in terms of envisioning what these spaces looked like, they do genuinely seem to have been exclusively male European spaces. The ship itself, the shore camp, things like that. Even and again, their interaction with indigenous people is harder to tell, but probably heavily male. Which is crazy, but also like in the grand annals of the Atlantic world is not what we see in many places where sort of the gender dynamics are quite different in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in Spain, and elsewhere. But it's another way that sort of Terra Nova is just very weird. I realize that's not the answer you were expecting, but I mean, no one has found any evidence, direct or indirect, not archaeological, not written. And I find it fascinating, and that has caused me to think a lot more about the gender dynamics. The inverse, I will say, what I think is also interesting, in which I haven't done the work on because it would be a huge undertaking, is what happens to fishing communities when all the guys go to Terra Nova. So like a port like Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which has about 12,000 people in the 1500s, sending 20 to 30 ships every summer to Terra Nova, a huge portion of their male population leaves for 5 months a year. There's been studies in the Dutch context by Annette de Wit about sort of what that does to places like Maaslaus, which is a big herring port in the Netherlands, and how it like totally reconfigures sort of gender dynamics within the city because so much of the male population is fishing. But no one's done the study, I think, sort of how that looks in with Terra Nova. It would be possible. You just have to go through thousands upon thousands of notarial records. Just as the last thing I'll say, on the French 16th century bureaucratic rules, there's a thing called a transport, which is a legal document where you alienate a legal right. So basically, I could say, I am giving my wife the right to collect this debt that is owed to me, or I'm giving her the power of attorney. And I would be very curious if there's an uptick of those in the spring as people leave. I don't know. I haven't been able to sort of do the deep digging because that would be a dissertation project in its own. But it's an open question. Does that answer your question? They are certainly hierarchical. In French, the name for the shipmaster, the captain, is maître après Dieu, master next to God, to give you a sense of just sort of the coercive authority. Below that, it's hard to tell how hierarchical things are, or if they're relatively flat. But I would point out, especially from the mid-century on, a lot of these ships are sailing armed. The best evidence we have for violence in the fishery is indirect, and the fact that a lot of these ships buy cannons and guns and weapons before they leave because they are expecting something to happen. And I think some of them might carry soldiers. A lot of them carry carpenters and things to fix the ship. But yeah, I think there is a possibility. I would say there's one reference to a Spanish Basque raid on a Breton fishing camp in 1554, where they talk about the Bretons had barricaded themselves into a harbor in Terra Nova and had built a fort. And the Spanish Basques, as they say, attack them with banners flying in column, implying that they were sort of organized like a mid-16th century military force, and overwhelm the defenses, seize cannon, and turn it on the fishing ships. It is one of those sources that is incredible. I should have included in here, but we have no idea what to do with it because, like, why was there a fort in this harbor? Why had they built a chain across the entrance? Was this always happening? Is this the middle of a war? Like, who are these people bearing flags, marching on a fishing camp? It's so bizarre that it's really hard to extrapolate from it. But I think you're right that there's, given that there is no such thing as sort of a professional military in the mid-16th century, everyone is quasi-military, and they certainly are.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I think I find the idea of Terra Nova as this kind of moving target that is seasonal and moves with the people really compelling. And I think it makes inherent sense to everyone in the room because we have the same thing here. It's called Paternoville, and it's also very male and it's seasonal, and it's sort of a seasonal camp that's set up for football watching.
Yes.
But I also want to say that I think the idea of trying to visualize it is really helpful, and that the images you shared really showed how the water is an important space, and that's where the work is happening. So I have a specific question about the maps, and I'm glad you have this one up, because I want to ask about the sandbar. Is that what's depicted looking almost like a rope?
Yes, I think that is supposed to be the Grand Banks, which is this big offshore. So the actual Grand Banks don't look like that at all. They are, let me see if I have an earlier map that has the actual sort of like shape of it, because it's much more sort of triangular in shape. But that seems to be someone who heard, oh yeah, there's sand offshore. Right, so this is sort of the actual shape of the Grand Banks. I guess it does kind of curve like that, but that seems to be what it's depicting.
Well, and I just want to ask a follow-up about how they're experiencing that, because of course, in a later period, this would be an obstacle, but it seems like maybe it's a landmark or maybe a place where they fish. And the way they depict it, I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about what that meant to them, if that was a destination or an obstacle.
So great question. So it's, as this map suggests, it's huge. You know, it's Le Grand Bank. It's the big offshore bank, and the name is somewhat misleading. And I think this is what the map maker has sort of been confused by, because it's not terribly shallow. It's more than enough depth that you can sail over it without difficulty, but it's shallow enough that it changes the underwater ecology, and it makes for an outstanding fishing ground as well as bird feeding ground. So I think Gastaldi has heard, oh, there's a big offshore fishing bank, and he assumes it's kind of this raised bar. But really, it's this big sort of slightly shallower shelf that very early on they seem to. I mean, it's one of those things where it seems to be named and identified by fish workers, not explorers. They're the ones. Cape Breton, La Grande Baia, all of these are fish worker names. They figure out really early on, and the fact that he depicts it suggests it was sort of common knowledge. One of the big things about the Grand Bank is it's where, by the kind of end of the century, you will get what's often called like the wet fishery. So some of us, we were talking about this earlier, there's a lot of different ways to preserve cod. One of the ways you can do it that the French love, especially the Normans, is you make this thing called morue verte, green cod, where instead of drying it, you pickle it. So you take a barrel, and kind of like you do with herring, you're slicing and killing cod, throwing it, and just heavily salting it. So it will not last as long as dry salted or dried cod. But you can make it quite quickly, and you can make it offshore. So you don't need a drying station. By the late 16th century, the Normans sort of start dominating the Grand Bank, and they will spread out, and they will just go fill up as many barrels as they can and sail back to Normandy. And sometimes they'll do 2 trips a year. But because I think it's shallower, there's just a ton of codfish there. There's enough birds there that it's easy to sort of catch them out of the sky. Like, they follow the ship, so you always have provisions. But you often, these Norman crews will like never set foot on shore. They'll go hoover up as much as they can, head back. That's a very different experience. The other thing about it is it's so important because the way you sail to Terra Nova, you are typically approaching from this direction. Just sort of the way the winds and currents work, you're often coming from the direction of the Azores Island or from Galicia. And even if you shoot straight across from Brittany, you will tend to approach in this direction. So it's often the first landmark. So you're right, like in theory, it should be an impediment, but it's definitely navigable enough that it's very welcome when they see it. And that's different from like Sable Island, which is a death trap, because it's this kind of shifting actual sand island that is hard to detect. And I think it's often called the graveyard of the Atlantic. Like, there's a lot of shipwrecks there. And the rest of the coast is also quite tricky, and there's icebergs and fog and things. But yeah, they figure out quite early that they love the bank.
So we from central Pennsylvania, where we are, the sea could not feel more distant and alien. But your wonderful talk, really rich with images and texts and wonderful presentation, made us visualize and feel the sea in a way very few speakers can from central Pennsylvania. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Bouchard.
Thank you for coming out. Bring a little bit of the